very pleased to have Sarah West introduce us to some of our national parks. And Sarah, you're on.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm just going to try to move something off the middle of the screen. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. And I think we're sharing. You can see the screen on Zoom. Diane, is that working on Zoom?
Very okay. Beautiful Acadia National Park.
All right. So this morning, we're going to visit two national parks, one of them being Glacier Bay and the other being Acadia National Park. They're on two opposite coasts, one on the far west, northwest, and one pretty far northeast. And I hope you will enjoy it. So let's see if we can get this to advance. Okay. I am having trouble getting this to advance. Next. All right, here we go. So I want you to know that the sources that we have for these two programs are extensive and really very interesting. The National Park Service has wonderful sources on both national parks, and I use them heavily. Wikipedia I used, as well as some stuff on photography. There are reports for both the Tlingit and Mount Desert Island from early explorers that one can look at, and you can see the names of the ones that are here for Vancouver. Okay, both our parks, both on the east and the west, have very fascinating geological histories. Both of them are made by something called terrains. Terrains are pieces of land that are stuck on the oceanic crust, and when continents collide, they stick on a new continent. If you think of the Mediterranean, all those islands in the Mediterranean are terrains, and the Mediterranean is shutting. And in maybe several 100 million years, they're going to have shut. And those Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, they'll all be terrains stuck on Northern Europe and right in the middle of Northern Europe and Africa. So these terrains make up a huge amount of the Northeast, the West Coast. And that's what makes Alaska so interesting. And they're relatively new, so they can be identified. On the East Coast, there's a terrain called Avalonia, and that makes up much of the coast of Maine. And there's some older ones, the Gander terrain, and maybe some that are even older. And those are harder to identify because they're older. So we're going to start with Glacier Bay National Park. And if I look at the map for all of Alaska, Glacier Bay is right up in here. It's in the southern part of Alaska, right where this point comes out. And if we get a bigger map where we enlarge this little Y right in here, you can see that this is Glacier Bay, and it empties out into a sound out in here, which we'll refer to later. And it's got mountains, it's got extremely interesting terrain. So this is an aerial view of Glacier Bay. Calvin Coolidge made it a national monument in 1925. It became a national park in 1978. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And in 1986, it's called a Biosphere Reserve, which is one of the places where they're trying to conserve and protect wildlife and also plants. So glaciers, Glacier Bay has a lot of them. Glaciers are moving rivers of ice that lead down from mountains and from mountain snowfields. And this is a picture of the John Hopkins Glacier taken in 2002. Let's see if I can get rid of that. Go back. The park has 1,045 glaciers in all. 7 of them are what we call tidewater glaciers, which means they empty into the ocean, and the others don't. They are still in structures that would be called rivers. There are 1,045. I'm not going to tell you about all of them, for which you'll be glad. Most of them are retreating. They're with climate warming. There are a number of them that are stable, but I'm going to just show you a few. This is the John Hopkins Glacier. It's a mile wide, 12.5 miles long. The left-hand picture shows about the picture in 1900, and you can see that's quite similar to the right-hand picture, which is the picture that was taken in 2020. Now, glaciers, when they grow, they make moraines at the bottom. They push debris out in front of them. And we're going to see some moraines in these pictures. There's a very famous moraine in New England that you might have visited. It's called Cape Cod. And Long Island, New York, Long Island is also a moraine. Some of these can be pretty big. This is the inlet that goes up into Glacier Bay. The picture on the left shows you about 1800. The glaciers came all the way down there. A recent picture is on the right. It doesn't look like it's got glaciers at all. You have to go 65 miles up that bay to see glaciers. This is a McGargy Glacier. It's again 1 mile wide, 21 miles long, and it is stable. It's not advancing or retreating. And my cousin and I went and visited it. Notice that it's turquoise, it's sapphire blue. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's what happened. In 1680, and it was visited in 1680 by early explorers, it was a broad valley with a glacier moving down it. There were Native American indigenous people that lived there called the Tlingit, and they have description of it as a large valley with a lower bay. They lived there. It was harsh but habitable. But then the glaciers, there was a little ice age in the early 1700s, and the glaciers advanced, as you can see the picture on the right. And by 1750, the Tlingit had been forced out of the bay by that glacier advance. And this was described by Joseph Whidbey on the ship, the Discovery. And the ice goes all the way out the mouth of that bay. But then starting in around 1800, there was very rapid retreat of the glaciers. And by 1880, you can see in the picture on the left how far they've gone up. It's now exceeds the initial picture we saw. And today you have to travel 65 or more miles up the bay to view the glaciers. The rate of retreat for the Muir Glacier in the center is, and for any glacier, can be as much as 10 to 15 feet of it in a day. Now, glaciers form in mountains, and the highest mountain in Glacier Bay is Mount Fairweather, over 15,000 feet, and it connects to a Bradley ice field, and that's where the glaciers start. They start when the snowfall exceeds the melting rate, and the snow that lands on top of other snow compresses it and makes it into ice. And that ice is going to have a very blue color. But Libby Brown sent me a picture of herself on an ice field. She sent me some other pictures. I think that might be the glacier field in Montana. I don't think it's the one, Glacier Bay, but I loved seeing that. Anybody here visited a glacier, gone out on one? Yay, look at that. Okay, so you can add comments at the end, all right? Okay, glaciers advance, and when they do, they act as forceful bulldozers. and they push a pile of debris in front of them. They are very powerful, and they carve out U-shaped valleys. You may have seen if you've been to a number of other places, but that U-shaped valley is the footprint of a glacier. They also leave scratches on the rocks that they go over, and you can see these scratches in here in different places. This rock has probably had glaciers advance and retreat, and so it's got scratches in different directions. We also find them in Maine and New Hampshire. We don't find them in Pennsylvania because glaciers came down probably as far as the national, some of the state parks in the northeast corner, but then they didn't come down. So you can see the blue color, the sapphire blue. And so glaciers, as they melt, are going to do what's called calving. And you can, hunks of ice will fall off the front. You don't want to be underneath. I did go on a National Geographic trip to Glacier Bay, and that's a picture of us being taken in a little Zodiac. They didn't get too close, but we could go right up to the glacier. And some of you may have had that experience as well. So a retreating glacier leaves a moraine at its mouth, and this is a picture of the Grand Pacific Glacier, which is 2 miles wide, 35 miles long, and it is retreating. And you can see the glacier, the moraine forming right down here. At some point, the current, if it gets weak, this area would fill in. If you can believe it or not, that's how we got Cape Cod. So there are no roads into Glacier Bay. If you come, you have to come by a cruise ship or plane. There are over 2,200 recorded ships coming in. And in 22,000, we had over 2.9 million visitors. They come in sometimes in very, very large ships. I was in quite a small one. And for that reason, we could go different places. Okay, let me get rid of that. Okay. There is wonderful wildlife in Glacier Bay. You were going to see a little bit of it close up. There are sea lions. Now, these are different from seals in that they have ears. If you look at a seal, you would see a harbor seal. There would be no ears. There are also harbor seals there, but they have a very thick layer of fat insulation, so they can really be in very cold water. All the very cold environment animals have a lot of fat around them as insulation. They can get around, they can get up on and move around on land surprisingly fast. And they're amazingly athletic underwater. The males can weigh 2,000 pounds. The females average 600. And the males compete for harems. So you'll see a single male with a large collection of females around him. The unsuccessful or immature males, they have to go congregate somewhere else. And this is what we see on an island called Marble Island. These are all the hopeful bachelors over here. They have declined in number in the past decade, as have harbor seals. Now, in addition to those very charming, we have charming sea otters. And these are amazing animals. The Glacier Bay is a sanctuary for whales and all these other animals, but they have rebounded from nearly 0 to over 9,000 in the year 2000. They have the thickest coats of all mammals, and remember, they were harvested and killed to make fur coats, really to the point where they were almost extinct. It was the young that were killed to make weight for seal fur coats. And there were groups of people who would go out when the babies were on ice and cover them, put big marks on them with spray paint so they would be useless, and hopefully trying to conserve these babies. But in Glacier Bay and a lot of other places now, you can't kill them. And let's see what else. Oh, they eat, let's see, they eat clams and crabs and shellfish. They float on their backs while eating and grooming, and they also carry their young on their backs and their bellies. They're fascinating to see. A lot of mountain goats in Glacier Bay, and you may have seen them if you went there, but they have a very effective solution.
The prosecutors say that his DNA was at the scene of the murder, but
they're
his team
apparently
argues
made of hollow hair, and that adds
office home or car.
excellation.
The father of one of the students reacted
Does
to the
somebody
prosecution's
have
decision to
a phone on? Okay, she did it. Thank you, Diane. They are very graceful. They leap from ledges you wouldn't believe they could leap from. And oh, I forgot to tell you something about the sea otters. The sea otters are like us. Their hair turns gray when they get old. I think that mountain goats, humpback whales abound in Glacier Bay and also in the Icy Straits, which is the name of the ocean that's just outside of Icy Bay, of Glacier Bay. And again, they're in a sanctuary. They get identified on research by their tails. Their tails have unique characteristics, and they get photographed, and then the whale gets a number, and its tail, for somebody who has a lot of whale tail pictures, you can match them up and tell which whale you have. They are baleen whales, and you can see skeleton there, what baleen looks like. They don't have teeth. They filter the food they take in, and this is what their spout looks like. But for the humpback whales, I'm going to just go back for a minute. You can look at that one. They still are considered endangered. And there's a lot of research done on them, on their sounds, their migrations. Let's see, they're over 35 tons, 40 to 50 feet long. They migrate between Glacier Bay and Hawaii, a 2,500-mile migration each way, and that takes about a month each way. But they go to Hawaii to mate and give birth in warmer waters, and they don't eat much while they're doing that. But when they get back to Glacier Bay, they are very hungry, and they eat a great deal of krill and other small organisms that abound in very cold waters. And so it's a good place to do research. Okay. Of course, there are lots of orcas. And again, research is done on orcas. I hear they're attacking boats in different places in the Mediterranean. Apparently, there are human beings that have crossed, they're on there in the doghouse with them. They're very intelligent. I went out on one of these zodiacs with our guides, and we were surrounded by orcas. And fortunately, I don't think people taste good to orcas, so they left us alone. And I'm here to tell a tale. Bald eagles all over the place. And remember, in the lower 48, DDT almost wiped them out. They've come back to the point where they're almost a pest. We have moose and deer. And let's see what I find about moose. The bulls can be 1,600 pounds. The females are a mere 1,300. And they're usually solitary, but in the rutting season, the bulls, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of this, really fight to have access to the females. The females give birth to either one or two reddish calves that they care for about 2 years. And then they're not very nice about getting their babies to grow. They drive them off. I thought that might be a good thing for humans too at times. And then the brown bear. We saw a lot of brown bears. These are in the, they're called brown bears in Alaska, but they really are related to grizzlies. And they're very fierce. And you can see they enjoy fish. We would go hiking in various places, and our guides would either ring bells or they would say, "Yo, bear." And they generally will leave you alone, but if you startle them, that's not likely to be a pretty scene. And here's just a research vessel that they show that they go out, do all kinds of research on fauna, flora, and that's what it should say, and also human archaeology. So let's talk a little bit about human archaeology. Maybe as early as 10,000 years ago, the Tlingit indigenous people lived in the Glacier Bay region. As we said before, they got dislodged at one time from Glacier Bay. There are archaeological sites that have been studied, but most of them have been wiped out because of the glacier advance. But there are some that are 200 years old or a little less. They were seagoing, hunting, matrilineal people, very skilled in canoe building. And they, at one time, the Russians owned Alaska and have a great influence in their villages there. And the Tlingit traded with the Alaskans, with the Russians. Now, this is a picture that might show you what they looked like. In warm weather, they wore practically nothing, but in very cold weather, I read they wore garments made of mammal skins. And the women went barefoot, even in the snow. They were a matrilineal group. The indigenous people that occupied both Glacier Bay and later in Acadia came seasonally. They didn't stay in one place all year round. They would go in the summer to harvest fish, dry it, and berries and other things that were abundant in certain locations. And then they would move to other sites for different seasons when the weather changed. The Lenape who lived in this area did the same thing. And their whole concept of land use was that it was not private, but it was, you didn't own it, but you had the rights to use it. And the indigenous people would give rights to use land to certain other people in exchange, probably for rights to use land. And I think when they were signing treaties with Europeans, that's what they thought they were doing. And later on, the Tlingit are driven out of Glacier Bay because the National Park Service comes in and forbids some of the things that they do as part of their style of life, such as whaling. And the Tlingit gathered gull eggs. That was part of their diet. And in the early 1900s, gulls were very endangered. Their feathers were being used for hats, and it was forbidden to gather their eggs. So the indigenous people are, in almost all the cases of our national parks, they are forbidden to follow their customs. And that's part of the story that I'll be telling in this season. But they're fishing people, and the women pick berries, they hunt mammals, they hunt whales, and they live in cedar houses, which very large cedar houses, and that house many families, much the way the Lenape did and a lot of other indigenous people. Because of the conflict between the Tlingit and the National Park Service, these things had to be worked out. And they tell their history in totem poles. And this totem pole is called the healing totem pole because over time, these tensions have been alleviated. And so they built a totem pole, which was put up I think around 1996. And it stands at the head of the Bartlett Cove, and it tells a story, and I'm going to show you parts of it. It's made of 20 feet of yellow cedar, and it's really beautifully carved. It describes their migration. They've left Glacier Bay, they went back, they left seasonally, they've had many trips, and that's part of their history. It talks about the period of alienation and the collaborative efforts that have developed in recent years. But here's what, working from the top 10, The picture on the left is the carving that represents the spirit of the glacier that came in and drove them out. And it destroyed their community that they called Lituya Bay. And so that's represented in the middle picture. And then the third picture over commemorates their first return in their cedar canoes that they made. They come back. But this is the representation of the National Park Service, a faceless soul with too many hands. And the second represents the tears of their elders for the loss of their homeland. That represents the sorrow they experience by being excluded or being denied practices. In the 1990s, the federal government the National Park Service begins working with the Huna Tlingit to find a common ground. And in 1995, they signed a memorandum of understanding, agreeing that both parties would work together to mend the relationship and restore the Tlingit to Glacier Bay. And so that carving on the pole represents that memorandum of understanding. And then they have all running up and down this beautiful totem pole. They have feet, and the feet represent the many times they've come back and left because they continue to move seasonally. But that's the story. Now, in August 2016, they opened a special house called a tribal house. And it's built, you can see the outside of it on the left and the inside on the right. And it's a place where the Tlingit can come and follow some of their ancient practices, learn about them, have their own activities. And so it's a place for sharing and practicing ancestral cultural wisdom. And you can see some of these ceremonies occurring outside. And the picture on the right shows, again, the outside, I think the back, no, maybe it's the front. And it's got two other totem poles called the raven and the eagle. So there are a number of other indigenous people symbols there. So that's the part that we have on Glacier Bay. And Kathleen has some of the microphones here. I'm just wondering if some of you who visited Glacier Bay would like to make a comment on what you saw, what was particularly meaningful to you. And Tama would like a microphone right here. It's coming. Oh, wait a minute. I know what. Is it working now? Not yet? Yes. Yay.
In 1998, my sister and I took a cruise up to Alaska, and like you and the one that you were talking about, we were on a very small boat. Some of these boats will hold thousands of people. Ours held 74. And so because we were a small boat, we could get really in close to the shore. And instead of having, you know, like barbecues and stuff like that, that they would entertain us with, we had two Tlingit storytellers, and we had two naturalists on the ship, and they would, because we had a low raft, we were getting quite close to the shore. And at one point, we went to the raptor rehabilitation center where they were taking care of eagles who had been damaged and getting them back in shape again. So and it was a very, very interesting trip, and I think much more interesting than being on a cruise.
Yeah.
Which is like
Yeah. One of the members on our ship said something about those huge cruise ships. And I thought our guides we tend to look down our noses at them. But the guide said, this is what enables a lot of people to see Glacier Bay. And most people who go on cruises like that can't afford the smaller ships. So I got a different, in my mind, that these, and they have guides, they have programs, they don't see everything we see, but it enables them to learn about Glacier Bay and the importance of conservation. And so I did show you a picture of a large ship. I tried to develop a more positive attitude. You just don't want to get off in the harbor with all of them. Yeah.
Oh, Sarah, Sarah, the microphone helps you in the classroom, but it's not very clear on Zoom. And if anyone is able to.
Oh,
come to
okay,
the
all right.
computer,
You know what? You're
it's
right.
clearer.
You're right, Diane. Tom had told us about her trip to Glacier Bay, and I should have people come up and speak right into this microphone. Can you do both?
So I talk into this too?
Yeah.
So I was on one of those very large cruise ships with several thousand passengers, and it was very spectacular because you're cruising along, and all of a sudden you turn a corner and there are these huge glaciers that are just magnificent. But we had 4 ports of call, and I can't remember which one it was, but I did something extra on my own. They offered a helicopter ride up to the top of one of the glaciers, and I went on it. And you got out, and they gave you these special boots that you could wear, and it was like walking on the moon. I just loved it.
I'm just gonna say, Kathleen, if you have a picture of doing that with your boots and you send it to me, I'll put it in the program. I would love to have more. And I know Mary's been to Alaska. Do you have a comment you'd like to make? You got to come up here and talk into this thing so the assembled multitudes on Zoom can hear you.
Hello, assembled multitudes. Hello, assembled multitudes. I was in Alaska. I did take a small day trip to the glaciers. I'm not exactly sure if it was Glacier Bay we were at, but looking at your map, Sarah, it could be because we were in Resurrection Bay. And we took a small boat, and yes, the wildlife was just spectacular. I'm a bird watcher, and we saw puffins. And the western puffins are very different than the eastern puffins. And we saw the sea lions with their harems, and the cute little sea otters. Oh my God! So, but the Tlingit stuff sounds really fascinating. We didn't have any of that. Oh well.
All right, so we are going to move on to the second half of this program, which is on the opposite coast, and Acadia National Park, which you can visit year-round. And Acadia, like Glacier Bay, was assembled by both plate tectonic forces and glaciers. And the picture in the middle is the area view by Martin Adamiker. And you can see a map of Acadia on the left-hand side, and the green parts in that map are all part of Acadia National Park. Acadia National Park has 47 square miles on Mount Desert, and then 3.5 more square miles on the Schoodic Peninsula. And then it also has 4.6 miles on an island called Ilaho. And in this, here's Schoodic. Oops, we went back. Schoodic Peninsula doesn't want to stay there. Right here is probably right over here. And Ilaho is down in here. Yeah. All right. And again, I just remind you that it's got these terrains, these strange pieces of land that came from the oceanic crust. The Atlantic Ocean at one time did shut. And as the Pacific Ocean is a shutting ocean now, the Atlantic shut 250,000 million years ago. And so that's the time the Maine coast is forming. But the picture here shows beautiful view from Mount Cadillac, looking at what's called the Porcupine Islands. And it just summarizes that are three major periods of sediment foundation. It's very much like the Wissahickon, 500 to 600 million years ago. Then a volcanic island arc and a continental plate collision with the formation of the famous granites about 450 million years ago. And then 2 to 3 million years ago, the glaciers molded this land. So if the continents change or climate warming changes the poles, maybe the areas around Glacier Bay would start to look like this far, far into the future. And I thought understanding glaciers would help us understand where these things come from. But one of the periods is a volcanic period. There's a whole bunch of islands that have formed. It's like Japan off the East Coast, and they're being pushed towards the East Coast, and they're all volcanoes that are developing. A lot is going on underground, maybe as far as 10 miles buried. Not all volcanic action comes to the surface. Some of it does, and some of it did in the Acadia area. And so there was volcanic ash that fell. But a lot of the volcanic activity was intrusive, which meant it never came to the surface. And lava would push up and form these big domes. Now, these domes are maybe as much as 10 miles underground. How can we see them? Over time, all this activity has eroded away, both ordinary erosion and glacial action. So this is a huge dome of volcanic material of granite that developed deep in the earth, and it stayed in a dome portion because it didn't erupt. And one of the characteristics of volcanic rock is that it forms columns like this. And we've seen it. I showed it in the picture that showed the Grand Canyon. If you've ever been to Ireland and walked across the giant steps, same thing. These pillars, sometimes of basalt, sometimes of granite. And so that's an evidence of volcanic action. Deep underground, granite has formed. That's the pink stuff here. And later on, more eruptions occur, and you get these intrusions of dark. This is gabbro or basalt in very deeply buried rocks. Remember, we're not seeing this on the surface. It's action that's due to continental plate collision, melting volcanic action deep underground. And this is a piece of basalt that's pushed up into a layer of granite. It's actually the basaltic rock called gabbro. It's black, it's dark, it's very different in color from granite, and it's much heavier. I have a piece actually of basaltic rock and in one hand and a piece of granite in the other, and I let people hold them. And the granite is so much lighter than the basalt. Our continents are actually floating on this oceanic crust. Ruby Brown sent me a picture from Schoodic Point that she took again with this intrusion of, and it's a dike because it's pushing up. And her other beautiful picture shows the action in the water that I think is so lovely there. Now, after all this volcanic actions, the laying down of sediments that became turned into rock that got metamorphosed by deep in the ground plate tectonics, the park is being scoured 2 to 3 million, maybe as many as 3 million years ago, but 2 to 1 million years ago. There are a succession of ice sheets that flow across North America and Europe. And each glaciation removes all the traces of the other ones. So this is a picture that lets you see a map of this country, and it's called the Laurentide ice sheet, and it does come down into Maine. This is part of Maine. Here's Pennsylvania. But the Wisconsin glacier, this is showing it from the pole. It pushes way down into Europe. It pushes down into North America. And that one comes down as far as northern part of Pennsylvania. Hickory Run was probably covered with glaciers, but not any further south. We didn't get them down here. We're going to look at the glacial features that remain on Acadia Island. But the biggest action of the glaciers were the creation of this thing called Somes Sound, which is an aerial view. There was a glacier that pushed down here and gouged this out. The glaciers also gouged out this lowland, but they left the granite domes and the ancient mountain tops. And here's a moraine across the mouth. I think this is 5 to 7 miles long. And you may have driven up into Somes Sound, or maybe people have been up there in a boat. How many of us have been to Acadia, to Mount Desert Island? Okay, so you're really looking at stuff that's familiar. Okay. On the summit of Mount Cadillac, the granites are 420 million years old, and it was ground down by glaciers. And in places you can see these glacial scratches that we mentioned in the glacial bay. And I love the fall colors. And this is one of the small lakes. The glaciers produced on Mount Desert Island. There are a lot of mountains, 17 of them, over 20 freshwater lakes or ponds. And they were made by the glaciers of grinding away softer rock and sometimes putting a moraine right at the end of what would be a stream. But the colors in these are beautiful. The beaches that we have on Mount Desert Island and all along the northern Maine coast are covered with glacial till. This is rock that just got pushed down in front of the glaciers. It's rounded, it looks like it's abraded. And on the right-hand side, it's the Schoodic Peninsula. And the left-hand side just shows you, I don't know where it is, but it shows you those rounded rocks that have been shoved for miles. We have no idea where they came from. But I'll tell you, this is the ideal nursery for baby lobsters, for lobster juveniles to grow. And that's why you get so many of these beautiful Maine coast lobsters, where you get these gravel glacial till beaches. Here's a glacial erratic. Sometimes a glacier would leave a very large rock and go away, and the rock would be there just sitting there. But Dennis Brunn made a pastel of a glacial erratic, and I love that picture, so I put it in. But here's one that's real, with a beautiful lake showing behind it. So it says the glacial molding of the landscape created over 20 lakes and kettle ponds. And this is one called Eagle Lake, the largest on Mount Desert. We've probably all been to Jordan Pond, which I'll show you later. In the fall, around the lakes, we get these beautiful colors. Now the wildlife, you would feel a little bit like you were right here in Philadelphia, because the wildlife is very, very similar. And squirrels, chipmunks, foxes, coyotes, black bears, deer. They also have beavers, Arctic hares. At various times, they I have a few things that we don't have. The beavers in Mount Desert got wiped out, but then in the 1920s, somebody brought some beavers to Mount Desert Island, and we do find them there now. But so I'll do a little bit on human history. In 1604, Samuel de Champlain observed a large island. It was very high, and this is what he wrote. It is very high and cleft in places, giving it the appearance from the sea of 7 or 8 mountains, one alongside the other. The tops of them are bare of trees because there is nothing there but rocks. The wood consists only of pines, firs, and birches, and he named it Mount Desert Island. He went on to explore a lot of things, but he was one of the initial explorers that found the island. In 1613, there was a French missionary colony in America established on the island, but the British destroyed it as one of the beginning acts in the French and Indian Wars. In 1688, the King of France gives the island that he doesn't own to Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, and Mount Cadillac is named after him. This was amazing to me that the Europeans came over and gave away land they didn't own to anybody they liked. In Massachusetts, remember, Maine is part of Massachusetts at this point. In 1713, the British controlled the island. And in 1760, the Massachusetts governor is ruling what's happening. 1780, Massachusetts gives the eastern half of the island to Cadillac's granddaughter. And Bernard's son, the governor's son, has ownership over the western half. Most of Mount Desert Island was in private ownership. And as the development of the park occurs, these privately owned lands are being given to the park or sold. So it is a very different, doesn't come directly from the indigenous, the Wabanaki people that lived there. In 1855, we start to get the first visitors. There's a steamboat service from Boston, and there's what's called the Green Mountain Cog Railway that's built from Eagle Lake to the summit of Mount Cadillac. I think it's probably a little more modern now. Mount Cadillac was called Green Mountain at first. In 1901, the Maine legislature starts the process. It grants Hancock County, which is the county where Mount Desert is, a charter to develop the land on public interest. And the first land was donated by a Mrs. Elijah Homans. And by 1908, 5,000 acres had been, she gave it in 1908, 5,000 acres have been donated by 1914. And there are a lot of markers all through Mount Desert Island that commemorate the people making these donations. I think there's a law now that you can't put any more markers up. So if you're going to give land, you won't get recognized. 1916, Woodrow Wilson makes this a national monument. 1918, it becomes a national park, and it's called Lafayette National Park. First of all, in the memory of Marquis Lafayette, the French supporter of the American Revolution. In 1929, the name is changed to Acadia National Park in honor of the French colony of Acadia that was once in Maine and got dislocated. A lot of those folks went to New Orleans, but are still Acadians in Nova Scotia. And then the Scoodic Peninsula is added the same year. And that's a picture of the very ancient granites on Mount Desert Island. Oh, and I wanted to mention one other thing. Notice there in blocks, the island is still changing. It's doing something called weathering. Whenever there's a crack in a rock, it can get filled with ice in the winter. It can get bigger, and eventually the granite gets built into blocks. It's no longer a big granite flow, and sometimes they break down. And so that Mount Desert Island, and all the Maine coast is still changing by this force called weathering. Now we got to talk about John D. Rockefeller Jr. In a 15-year period, maybe 18-year period, he is involved in the construction of over 50 miles of carriage trails and 17 lovely granite bridges. And there are cut stones that are put along the edge of what were once carriage roads and that now can take cars. And they're called Rockefeller's teeth. Let me see if I can, here they are. There's Rockefeller's teeth. And they act as a kind of a barrier on the edge. After the fires in 1947, he was very helpful in restoring some of Mount Desert Island, but he did a great deal of work developing private land, which eventually is administered by the park. And I do remember this fire because the smoke from it could be seen in Friendship, Maine, which is where I have connections to Maine, which is way down in Muscongas Bay, way across Penobscot Bay to the southwest. But in 1947, there was a massive fire there. I think maybe rivaling what we've seen in Canada at the present time. It started in a cranberry bog and nobody knew what made it start, but it smoldered underground for a long time and then finally burst out and began to approach Bar Harbor. It destroyed 67 majestic seasonal homes on Frenchman's Bay. It was called Millionaires Row. And it also described 170 permanent homes and 5 large hotels. The opulent homes were being too hard to maintain. They were getting taxed. Many of them were never rebuilt, and the tourist accommodations came in. But over 17,000 acres were burned, 10 of them in the park. And I just want to read you a little bit about what happened because I found it intriguing. On October 22nd, it's approaching Bar Harbor. And I'm glad I wasn't there. In less than 3 hours, the wildfire traveled 6 miles. It swept down on Millionaires Row and the rest of Bar Harbor. Bar Harbor residents, they called in firefighters from anywhere they could get them. But Bar Harbor residents not actively engaged in firefighting tried to find safety, fleeing first to an athletic field and later to the town pier. At one point, all the roads from towns were locked in flames. So fishermen from nearby Winter Harbor and other places arrived by boat, and at least 400 people were taken off by boat. Finally, about 9 o'clock at night, the bulldozers opened a pathway on one of the routes, and a caravan of 700 cars carrying 2,000 people began the slow trip to safety in Ellsworth, Maine. According to eyewitness reports, it was a terrifying drive. Cars were pelted by sparks and flames flickered overhead, but the motorcade was orderly and successful, and people got out. But it sounds to me like what happens on the West Coast. Okay. So these are just some of the gorgeous scenery that you can see on Mount Desert Island. It will go through. You can visit a place called Thunder Hole, where the energy in that water is enormous, which you can see in that lower left picture. It comes in and makes a crashing sound when the water flows in there. Penobscot has 26 mountains, 17 of them can be climbed. This is Mount Mansell. And it just, after the glaciers moved back, the land has a huge weight taken off of it, so it tends to rise. And the glaciers, remember, have left the mountaintops, but carved the bays. This is a Blue Hill from a view from the Blue Hill overlook. There are wonderful forest trails, deep forest on Mount Desert Island, and beautiful ponds. And the left-hand one is a sand beach pond that has sand, really very fine sand made of shells, all kinds of shells. It must have been very ground. This thing is called the Beehive, which I showed you as an example of volcanic material earlier. And a lot of us have been to Gordon Pond. It's a major site. It's got a lovely little tea house there where you can have an elegant tea, and there's some twin hills in the back. There are 4 lighthouses in the park, and actually you can see the This is Bass Head Lake, and you can see the rock being broken down and weathered in that picture. And the nighttime skies are just gorgeous. That's the Milky Way. It has a rift valley going through it, and at night it sometimes really just glows. Also had its own indigenous people. And that should say the Wabanaki Confederation of the Abenaki Nation. And these were people, I think this is a pretty accurate picture. They came seasonally, as did the Tlingit, into Somme Sound to gather the resources for there. They lived in teepees. The women would gather shellfish, berries. The men would do the hunting, and they had handmade weapons that they used. Sometimes their arrowheads and things are still found. There are, as we said before, there are a lot of archaeological sites that are being researched. The picture on the left is what's called a midden. The trash heaps and shell heaps from the Indians were left, and you can look in them and see what was there. Now the shell and then a little bit of their pottery and a flute, a bone flute has been found. But usually bones won't do well if you throw them out, they'll disintegrate. But the carbonates have, the shells are carbonates, and they release a buffer that prevents acid disintegration. So you can find all kinds of bones in these middens, and you can tell what the Indians ate, what kind of birds they ate. They had bear, they had other kinds of bones that tell something. And I skipped that last. And so here's the last picture we have. The Wabanaki community still exists in Maine, but they live very much like we do. They drive cars, they live in houses. And I think if you met some of them on the street, you would not recognize them as indigenous people. And so their practices again were outlawed, but they again have had dealings with the National Park Service that have taken the pressures off, the tensions off the Park Service and the indigenous people following their cultural practice. But it's not quite as tense as it was in Glacier Bay. All right, so that's the end of this program. And next week, I've changed my mind. I'm not going to do what I put in the directory or in that flyer. I'm going to do Cumberland Island and the Okefenokee Swamp. And Mary and I went there together. So maybe you have some pictures I can put in. Yeah. Good. It'd be great. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And there we are. Let's get hi, and let's do, let's let all the people here. Let me see if I can. Okay, all right. So it is lunchtime. I'm going to stay for just a minute. Eva Marie, could you flick on the lights for us as you go by? And
Well, Sarah's doing whatever she's doing. I'll just share with you that Libby Brown, as many of you know, is on vacation in Maine. She's in Sorrento, and I had occasion to have a discussion with her yesterday by phone, and she said that there was a moose that washed up on their beach, and they called the game warden and just said he hoped that one of the time dinner would wash it out.
they don't smell very good. Actually, one of the things I saw in Glacier Bay, where it was a bunch of brown bears eating the carcass of a humpback whale. But a lot of animals eat this. So please, if you need to go to do the next thing in your life, don't feel you have to stay. But if you have something you would like to say, we would be glad to have you say it, in which, if not, I will just say thank you for coming, especially to the people on, and we'll see you next week. Okay, hopefully, one way or another.
Thank
And
you,
we can
Sarah.
end the meeting now, Diane.
Thank you.
I